Yes, good evening, everyone. Welcome here at the Balie, and also everyone who is watching this live stream from home to this last episode before the summer of the series Maxim Osipov Presents. This is a series of programs about art and culture from the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, curated by Maxim Osipov, who now resides, as you maybe know, in Amsterdam. Tonight, we will be listening to and discussing Shostakovich, his life and work, and the impact that the Soviet Union had on his art. And we will also try to draw parallels with the war in Ukraine today. We are very honored that Lev Akopian is with us here today, and he's head of the music theory department at the Russian State Institute for Art Studies. You will hear more from him later on. But I would first like to ask Maxim Osipov, the great Russian writer, to introduce this evening to us. Give him, please, a warm welcome.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. Okay. My role here tonight is more or less technical. I will change slides and I will introduce speakers. So the first speaker is Lev Akopian, who came from Moscow for this event, and he's an old friend of mine. We know each other for about 30 years. But more important that he's a very famous scholar of Shostakovich and of 20th century music. He was born in Yerevan and based in Moscow since 1993. He's Doctor of Science in Art History, and his major publications include the analysis of profound structure of musical texts, the Russian version of Grove's concise dictionary of music and musicians, which I was a publisher of this book, actually of 2 editions. Mozart, a guidebook, music of the 20th century, a concise encyclopedia. I also published that. So when I was a publisher in my previous years, music of the Soviet-era, and what is it, Sharakan? Yeah, is it correct? Canons and hymns of the Armenian Church, which he translated from classical Armenian, Old Armenian, into Russian. The Phenomenon of Dmitri Shostakovich, published in St. Petersburg, Great Outsiders of the 20th Century Music, and My Musical Worlds. So, Levon will have the 30 minutes talk tonight about art in totalitarianism, authoritarianism actually. So the second speaker tonight is Saskia Törnqvist. Please, Saskia, take your chair. Who is a musicologist, lecturer, and publicist. She graduated in 1995 at the University of Amsterdam on the Dutch reception of the work by Dmitri Shostakovich. For 20 years, she was a critic for newspaper Het Parool and editor-in-chief and concert programmer for various music festivals. Currently, she is a member in the program committee at the festival Musica Sacra in Maastricht. Since 2015, she teaches music and cultural history at the Conservatory of Amsterdam. Together with historian Luc, I'm afraid to mispronounce, thank you. She works on extensive book on music and romantic nationalism in 19th century Europe. And, okay, Okay. And Schenkschein, whom you have just, Schenk, please, yeah, join us. He is a Slavist. Yeah. He is a Slavist, a cultural historian and exhibition curator. He is the author of Sergei Diaghilev, Alive, and upcoming book on Van Hans van Manen. His books are translated, and also The Avant-Gardists. These two books are on this slide. His books are translated into Russian, English, French, Japanese, Czech, Bulgarian, Spanish, and Portuguese. So he will conduct the discussion, and he will address his questions to both speakers tonight. And here is the Eliot Quartet. The Eliot Quartet was founded in 2014. The quartet's members are Mariana Osipova, Alexander Zaks, these are violins, Dmitri Khakhalin, viola, and Mikhail Preuss. They formed the group in Frankfurt and have since gone on to win prizes at major music competitions, including second prize at Mozart competition in Salzburg, and the Melbourne Chamber Music Competition, the prize of the German music competition, and first prize at the Szymanowski competition in Katowice. Their schedule includes performances at renowned festivals and concert series throughout Europe. And the Eliot Quartet is named after the American poet T.S. Eliot, whose famous work, Four Quartets, was inspired by the innovative late quartets by Ludwig van Beethoven. The Eliot Quartet has released several recordings on genuine classics. Please, let's welcome Eliot Quartet. And so they will illustrate some passages from Levon's speech, and at the end of the event, they will play the third quartet of Dmitri Shostakovich. So, Levon, now I give you the podium, so please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, my dear friend Maxim. So I will begin with the question which is put very often. How is it possible to create art under totalitarianism or authoritarianism in the conditions when one is not free, in the conditions of unfreedom? So the best answer to this was given, one of the best answers to this was given by the leading contemporary Russian filmmaker, Alexander Sokurov. Next slide, please. While for democratic systems art is optional, states with a penchant for totalitarianism need it. Through art, which is to be sure controlled, a classical totalitarian state, and Stalin's USSR was, of course, one of the most typical paragons of totalitarian state. So classical totalitarian state demonstrates its omnipotence as well as the advantages of its political order. That's why the totalitarian power needs high-class artists. Stalin's regime killed a lot of people, but in culture a number of important figures were intentionally left untouchable. A totalitarian state is sensitive to outstanding figures. The system is ready to tolerate long enough those with the greatest achievements, such as Prokofiev, Shostakovich, and Eisenstein. To what extent great people agree to identify themselves with the totalitarian states is another matter. I suppose that no decent artist, writer, composer, painter would like to identify himself or herself with the contemporary Russian state, with the ideology of Putinism, which is stupid, purely destructive and suicidal. The same is true for the Nazi ideology, which is more or less the same. No decent artist agreed to identify himself or herself with the Nazi ideology. And not numerous exceptions only confirm the rule. With the Soviet Union and the Soviet community, it was somewhat different. And indeed, very great personalities worked in the lines of Soviet ideology. And therefore, a good deal of arts and letters created under the Soviet power still can be enjoyable and can be perceived as art and not only as ideology. It's true, and why it's so, it is an important question which could be discussed separately. In any case, the Soviet regime was vitally interested in having at its disposal some demonstrable models pertaining to high realms of art. The regime urgently needed a big style of its own, a spectacular style embodying its ideas, the rulers' ideas about greatness, beauty, and political expediency. So contemporary Russian regime is obviously absolutely important in any aspect, including culture, so it doesn't need a big style of its own. But in Stalin's, in Soviet times, it was different. And such great people as Shostakovich, for example, they were kept in a kind of golden cage. They were privileged. They could do their job. They were reprimanded from time to time, but anyway, they could survive, and the best diagnosis of Shostakovich's situation in the Soviet Union was given by the well-known British historian, Russian-speaking British historian, Sir Isaiah Berlin, who was responsible for Shostakovich's visit to Oxford when he came there to receive a honorary degree of Doctor of Music in 1958. Next slide, please. Yes, I see. The whole thing, he wrote afterwards, the whole thing has left me with a curious sensation of what it is to live in an artificial 19th century. For that, it is what Shostakovich does. And what an extraordinary effect censorship and prison has on creative genius. It limits it, but it deepens it. Shostakovich's face will always haunt me somewhat. It is terrible to see a man of genius victimized by a regime, crushed by it into accepting his fate as something normal, terrified almost of being plunged into some other life, with all powers of indignation, resistance, protest removed like a sting from a bee, thinking that unhappiness is happiness and torture is normal life. Indeed, Shostakovich, as a private person, could not express his indignations, he could not resist and could not protest. All this was expressed through his music. And his obedience to the regime was a kind of his duty or of his tax, which he had to pay for remaining for some degree of freedom in his work. Shostakovich was not only, in this respect, was not only the victim of the Soviet regime, he was also one of its pillars. He was the regime itself, to an extent. In contrast to those who have not experienced life under the Soviet regime, we can easily imagine how one and the same person can be both a model of non-conformist thinking and a Soviet loyalist, banner of Sovietness in culture. As any sane Soviet citizen, Shostakovich was critical of Soviet power, feared it and spoke ironically of it, as his letters to friends testify. At the same time, he had to come to terms with it, with the regime, according to the Russian proverb, which runs, «С волками жить, по волчьи выть». To live with wolves means to howl as a wolf, and sometimes would howl not without a certain pleasure. This may sound cynical, but people with Soviet experience will understand this feeling only too well. In his attitude to the regime, Shostakovich was no more principled than his average fellow citizens of sound mind. So Shostakovich was both the Soviet Russia's most loyal musical son, as the musicologist Richard Taruskin characterized him, but both Soviet Russia's most loyal musical son and a sincere hater of the regime. He was both the regime's victim and one of its pillars. His music was both a banner of dissidence and one of not numerous high-quality Soviet export products, side by side with weapons, Balie, hockey, oil, and gas. And we, people with Soviet and contemporary Russian experience, we understand him very well. Now I would like to quote my close friend, my very good dear friend, Alexander Shchetinsky, one of leading composers of Ukraine, who is based in Kiev. His piece, composed around a year ago, already during the months of this war, was performed in several European cities in the same program with Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony. And he wrote special text for the program book of these concerts. So the text runs, while still a schoolboy, I realized that Shostakovich's music is not only a profound and perfect art of sound images, but also a sign of human beings' powerful spiritual resistance to unfreedom, violence, and iniquity. Since then, Shostakovich has become for me a personification of struggle against any kind of totalitarianism. In the Ukrainians' resistance to the newest barbarism of Kremlin, Shostakovich and his music are our most sincere allies. So Alexander Shchetinsky said this, and indeed, with Shostakovich, nothing is one-sided, nothing is simple and clear. So another quotation I would like to bring from Aaron Copland, the American composer, the classical American composer, who wrote the following in 1949, when avant-garde was was especially in fashion, especially en vogue, to use the French expression. Aaron Copland invented a kind of rating of composers according to the degree of toughness of their language. So very easy, Shostakovich, Khachaturian, and others. Quite approachable, Prokofiev, etc. Fairly difficult, late Stravinsky, Bartok, Milhaud, and others. And very tough, Schoenberg, Berg, Weber, Dvarez, Ives, Sessions. And the final, he's summarizing here, writes, one of the toughest of all is Dvarez, and the easiest is centrally Shostakovich. He didn't know the early works of Shostakovich, which are very tough. which can be compared to Varese in terms of their musical language, in terms of their avant-garde musical language. But anyway, he wrote this in 1949. And in the year of Shostakovich centenary, in 2006, the leading Belgian musicologist Harry Halbreich said something opposite. With him, nothing is clear, nothing is simple. So his art can be simplistic, but this is not the same. Indeed, Shostakovich's art can be simplistic, but this simplistic quality adds to his complexity. And this is one of the major paradoxes in Shostakovich. The main, I would say, the main feature of Shostakovich's character as an artist is an organic incapacity to refrain from being ambivalent, contradictory, and even directly embarrassing and uncomfortable. And the device of breaking promise in pieces beginning in an apparently light mood has become one of the hallmarks of Shostakovich's writing, and we'll hear it today in his third string quartet. Now let's pass to Shostakovich's this particular work, the third string quartet, which can be characterized as one of his central works. It was composed in the year of his 40th birthday. For Shostakovich, the genres of symphony and quartet were these two genres were his privileged areas of composing. He wrote 15 symphonies and 15 string quartets. Interestingly, his first string quartet was composed when he had already completed his fifth symphony. That is, he was quite an experienced composer. In his symphonies, he tended to convey major messages, humanistic, great messages. In his quartet, he was, in general, more personal, more intimate. His first string quartet was composed in a happy year of his life. It's in 1938, when the whole country suffered the Great Terror, but Shostakovich himself could feel himself happy because he survived the terror, and his son was born around the same time when he composed his quartet. So he himself said that this quartet is sunny, it is joyful, it's springtime quartet. But even in this sunny springtime quartet, he allowed himself to several rather somber pages. One of these pages is the theme of the quartet's second movement. Dmitri will play it for us now. Yes, and then come variations on this theme. The second quartet was composed in the middle of the war in 1944, and Shostakovich naturally was obliged to show some patriotic feelings, some which could harmonize with the situation of war. But the final movement of this quartet is based on a theme which strikingly resembles the beginning of the opera Boris Godunov. And it's sung towards "Na kogo ty nas покинул," to whom have you abandoned us? And quoting, or almost quoting, from the least patriotic of all Russian operas, is again some strange thing which makes the whole work rather uncomfortable. Please show us the beginning of the finale. And then later, his next quartet, the fourth, after the third. The fourth was composed in 1949, when the wave of anti-Semitism, of official anti-Semitism, was very strong in Soviet Russia, in Stalinist Russia. And again, a risky trick on the part of Shostakovich was to include in the finale a theme of expressly Jewish coloration. Please play this excerpt from the finale. Many thanks. So Shostakovich expressed his personal sympathy with the Jewish cause in 1949. And thereafter, his quartet tend to be more and more personal, more and more intimate. And especially famous is his eighth quartet, which he composed as a requiem for himself. He was not so aged, and he was in a relatively good health, but he composed it in memory of himself. And the last bars of this quartet are just as hopeless adieu, hopeless farewell to the world. This ending of the eighth quartet. So, in his quartets, Shostakovich was, in general, very autobiographic. And the third quartet in this series can be treated as a synthesis of Shostakovich's personal experience of the war which ended in 1945, and the quartet was composed shortly thereafter. One well-known cellist, Valentin Berlinsky, who was in touch with Shostakovich from the mid-40s, wrote that the composer told them that although there was no program for this quartet, the idea was that the first movement depicts peaceful Soviet life. Nothing was occurring and everything was calm. The second movement was the beginning of the Second World War, also not yet in Russia, still outside the country, in Poland, Czechoslovakia. The third movement is the tank armada invasion of Russian territory. The fourth, a requiem for the dead, and the fifth movement, a philosophical reflections on the fate of men. All this is, of course, an apocryph. We cannot take it as a final truth, but anyway, there is a legend that the composer gave formal subtitle to the movements of his quartet, 5 movements of his quartet. First movement, calm on awareness of future cataclysms, then rumblings of unrest and anticipation, the forces of war unleashed, homage to the dead, and the eternal question, why and for what? Again, these titles are not authentic, and we have to take them with a grain of salt. But they can be helpful for the perception of the quartet as a synthesis of Shostakovich's war experience. But we cannot agree with the title of the first movement, Calm on Awareness of Future Cataclysms. Indeed, Shostakovich was incapable of being joyful and in major mode for a long time. He wrote to one of his colleagues that this piece must be performed tenderly rather than dashingly. But tenderness is not the word which is easily associated with Shostakovich. And since the very beginning, we can hear how the initial light mood becomes, almost from the very beginning, becomes rather somber because of these flat degrees which lead from major to minor. Let's show the very beginning of this quartet. And then later it will become more and more dramatic. It's by no means tender music. The second movement, rumblings of unrest and anticipation, can be performed in different manners. It can be played as a rather unhurried waltz, and indeed as something dramatic and anticipating something dangerous. So let's try both versions. The beginning of the second movement. version. Are absolutely correct, and any version can be chosen. And the third movement, the unleashing of the forces of war, it cannot be performed in so different manners. It is a kind of toccata, turbulent toccata, which can be compared with the second movement of his 10th symphony. Now let's listen to the beginning of this third movement and then pass to the 10th symphony. And 7 years later, Shostakovich composed, already after Stalin's death, Shostakovich composed his 10th symphony, whose second movement is considered a portrait of Stalin, so to speak, of enraged tyrant. And it's very similar in mood and in character to this piece. So it's augmented version of this third movement of string quartet. Then comes the homage to the dead, this mourning slow movement, and the finale, which begins already in pastoral mode, but Shostakovich cannot remain in pastoral mode for a long time, idyllic mode, then with a dance-like theme. But Shostakovich always breaks promises. And it is his know-how to begin quietly and then to develop music to the great culmination, great tragical culmination, which is a kind of explosion, of great explosion, just by the end of this finale. Both violins play in double stops, fortissimo, and viola and cello play the theme from the mourning to the dead. It's one of the most impressive pages in the whole quartet legacy of Shostakovich. And then he returns again to the initial idyllic mode, pastoral mode, but this is not the answer we see, the eternal questions, why and what for. But here, as usually with Shostakovich, the question is moved aside rather than resolved. And the work ends with a question mark than with a real ending. So it is always like this about Shostakovich. Breaking promises, being uncomfortable and rather embarrassing. 2 years after this quartet was composed, in 1948, Shostakovich was cruelly reprimanded by the Soviet cultural bureaucracy. He was declared formalist, un-Soviet composer, un-Soviet artist, and naturally his third quartet was banned, was not allowed to be performed on Soviet in Soviet concert halls. Well, now it's classical work, and we have to enjoy here not only its apocryphal program, which we can, even if we want, we can forget about it. We can enjoy the quality of music itself, its perfect form, its interesting developments, interesting themes, and of course the sensitive and virtuosic playing of our musicians. So, thank you.
Good evening. I hope you can hear me clearly. If not, please raise your hand, and I will do my best to make myself audible. First, I would like to express my gratitude for the invitation by the Balie to give my lecture here alongside Lev Akopian. Thank you very much for your interesting lecture. I will tell my story from two perspectives. As a former musicology student with a doctoral thesis on the Dutch reception of Shostakovich's music, and from my current role as a teacher of music and cultural history at the Conservatory of Amsterdam. To start with my current position, I have been teaching international groups of music students now for 8 years. And if there is one composer besides the inevitable Bach and Beethoven who is incredibly popular among my students, then it is Dmitri Shostakovich. Many students regard his music as a beacon of drama and humanity. But there's more to him. Shostakovich's music is woven into a narrative web that strongly appeals to the imagination. Who says Shostakovich, says Stalin, says terror. That tragic narrative certainly helps young musicians to form a vision about their interpretation of his music. They play it often as if their own lives depend on it. As a teacher with a chronic lack of time for a much too large curriculum, I'm faced with the same dilemmas every year. How am I going to introduce Shostakovich and his music to my students this time? Am I, as usual, going to talk about Shostakovich in the shadow of Stalin, or isn't it time to free his music from that heavy burden? Then the inevitable next question follows. Can his music be liberated from the Soviet context? Now the situation is even more complicated. Some of my classes also include Ukrainian students. All Russian music is sensitive to most of them. Even Stravinsky hurts. Yes, Stravinsky, who left Russia far behind and who could count on cold criticism from the Soviets. Some of my Ukrainian students have even their doubts about Shostakovich. Although I recently heard some of them say, that he doesn't have to be cancelled because Shostakovich was on the right side after all. Well, was Shostakovich on the right side? If you had put that question to a Dutch music critic 40 years ago, there was a good chance that the answer would be no. But before I explain this a little bit more, I invite you first to listen out of the blue, and we have a blue background here, to a passage from a symphony written by Shostakovich, and my explanation will follow later. I hope it works. This goes on for some time. You heard the closing bars from Shostakovich's Fifth Symphony, premiered in 1937. This piece is a common thread through my research into the Dutch reception of the man and his music. And therefore I researched articles and reviews that appeared in the Dutch press between 1970 and 1994. A lot changed during that period, and that was exactly what I wanted to investigate. Did the end of the Soviet-era and the Cold War affect the Dutch reception of his music? And if so, how? Back in the 70s, the icy wind of the Cold War blew over the Dutch flat landscape, which we call the polders. Shostakovich was regarded here as the mouthpiece of the Soviet system, and many Dutch music critics thought that you could hear that very, very well in his music. They denounced his vulgar melodies, his pounding rhythms, and his empty musical rhetoric. These are all quotations. Certainly, the reviewers on the right flank, the Telegraaf, were damning in their judgment. In fact, there was only one critic, whose name was Wim Klinkenberg, who systematically stood up for Shostakovich, and that was, not surprisingly, the music critic for De Waarheid, the Pravda, the organ of the Dutch Communist Party. But let's not forget the musical context in those days, the 70s. In the Western musical world, the classical, contemporary music world, experimental modernism was embraced. As a composer, you almost had the duty to walk ahead of the crowd. That was also the yardstick for many critics, especially on the progressive side, let's say the Volkskrant. Shostakovich, whose music had a heavy scent of the 19th Romantic century, was disqualified by them as traditional and obsolete. The major turning point came with this book. The major turning point in the Western Shostakovich reception came in 1979, 4 years after the composer's death, with the publication of this book, Testimony, the memoirs of Dmitri Shostakovich as related to and edited by Solomon Volkov. This book put a hidden side of the man and his music full in the spotlight. Who was that Volkov? In the preface, he introduced himself as a musicologist who had been allowed to have many, many lengthy conversations with the old and already very ill composer. Volkov worked out his shorthands in a manuscript. That's what he wrote in his preface. And Shostakovich signed each page, and Volkov fled to the West, where he had his manuscript published in New York. The Dutch translation followed 2 years later in the series of Privédomein by the Arbeiderspers under the title Getuigenis. And it hit like a bomb. That was in 1981. And it was as if all the music critics realized that they had been hearing deaf. What turned out in these conversations with Volkov, Shostakovich stated that he had lived and worked under horrific Soviet pressure. He had been mangled by a ruthless system that had dictated him both ideologically and artistically. Especially in the Stalinist period, he lived in the constant awareness that he could be arrested and deported, or even worse. It damaged the man, it marked his oeuvre. Testimony made the reader realize that there are two cracks running through Shostakovich's oeuvre, both vertical and horizontal. The vertical break divides his oeuvre on the one hand in occasional works, some of his symphonies, oratorios, film music, written in honor of Soviet life and events, and on the other hand in the dissident chamber music, works which he often wrote for his own desk drawer, music full of anger, sadness, and desperate silences, as we just could hear in the beautiful Eighth Quartet. The horizontal crack runs through much of his symphonic work. On the surface, they can often be regarded as a tribute to the people and the regime. But on a deeper level, there are hidden signals of aversion and resistance that can only be picked up by a good listener. Are you a good listener? Well, you just heard the finale of his Fifth Symphony, and you may have listened on an abstract level, much as the Dutch critics listened before 1979. But let's try to listen now from a more narrative point of view. In the years before the Fifth Symphony, Shostakovich, his opera Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk, an expressionist musical drama, enjoyed great success until one evil day in 1936 when Stalin paid a visit to the opera, and soon thereafter a review appeared in the Pravda with the title Chaos Instead of Music. It may have become the most famous music review in history. Shostakovich was criticized here for his decadent modernism, his formalism, and his vulgar, raw tone. All this took place at a time when the show trials were reaching their peak and the gulag filled up with prisoners. Shostakovich had a good reason to be terrified, but he was guarded, as Mr. Akopian just explained. Shostakovich hastily withdrew his hyper-expressive Fourth Symphony and made his comeback in 1937 with his Fifth Symphony, which was billed in the press as an artist's answer to justified criticism. According to the official program of this symphony, the first three tragic movements give voice to the suffering of a searching individual, and the final gives way to a joyful and optimistic tone. The protagonist has finally seen the light. Among Soviet critics, the symphony was interpreted as an homage to the official system, and maybe that's what you just experienced, an triumphant ending. But Volkov's book emphasizes something completely different. His Shostakovich says the following. I quote here Volkov. What is there to celebrate? I think what happens in the Fifth Symphony should be clear to everyone. There is forced jubilation, just like when you hit someone with a stick and say, you must cheer, and the beaten one gets up staggering and mutters, we must cheer, we must cheer. You must be a complete idiot not to hear that. Unquote, and sorry for that. The dissident Russian soprano Galina Vishnevskaya adds in her own book, which I consider significant, about the same bars we just listened to. In this supposedly cheerful, optimistic finale, in this trumpet blast and the endlessly sustained A that penetrates the brain like a nail, in this finale looms desecrated Russia, violated by her own sons, wailing and writhing in pain, nailed to the cross. Unquote. I don't think we have to listen once more to this, or shall we? Shall we listen once more? Yes? Yes? Okay, then we go. There we go. What? Next slide, please. Well, you got the full treatment. It was Yevgeny Mravinsky conducting, by the way. After the publication of Testimony, a stream of articles was released in the Dutch press, where reviewers loudly emphasized that they too could hear the double bottom very well. What was first dismissed as vulgar was now called ironic. They now recognized the pounding rhythms as the sound of a ruthless state machine. What was dismissed a few years earlier as hollow musical rhetoric was now recognized as a painful grimace of a composer who had an imaginary gun to his head. Shostakovich was recognized and embraced as a martyr, and very importantly, artistically upgraded at last. Narrative listening profoundly influenced artistic judgment. There was only one problem. American research provided convincing evidence that Volkov's book was a falsification, based on existing articles mixed up with stories from the corridors. And in an interview I had in 2006 with the composer's widow, Irina Shostakovich, I understood that Shostakovich had only 3 short meetings with Volkov, which he all considered very unpleasant. Nevertheless, she acknowledged that most of the content of Volkov's book was correct, more or less, but not the tone of the text. No, certainly not. Testimony remained a bestseller, and it is still a bestseller, and many students, also students, consult it as a primary source, unfortunately, so we teachers always have to warn them for this book. When Testimony turned out to be a forgery, the confusion around Shostakovich started to grow. And I want to show this confusion here. A cacophony erupted in the Dutch music criticism, where now suddenly everyone wanted attention for their own image of Shostakovich. Was he an heroic dissident in his own country, or a conformist, or a martyr, or a tragic figure who took refuge in a clownish pose, or maybe was he still a convinced communist? Wim Klinkenberg of De Waarheid was very convinced about the latter. Another discussion concerned listening to his music. How to do that? We just listened twice to the same fragment of the Fifth Symphony, first without background knowledge, for some of you. We listened first on an abstract level, next with some context on a narrative level. Abstract listening has the preference of many musicians here, especially those who are associated with the so-called The Hague School, the Haagse School, with Louis Andriessen, who was there a leading composer. I will try, yeah. Their ideas about abstract listening can be traced back to 1922, when this other Russian composer, Igor Stravinsky, wrote a famous text in which he stated, I will quote, "In general, I consider that music is only able to solve musical problems and nothing else, neither the literary nor the picturesque, can be in music of any real interest. The play of the musical elements is the thing," unquote. This statement made history in the short form, music expresses nothing but itself. Well, in this context, I would like to quote a music critic, Bas van Putten, who covered in the following citation the attitude of several influential Dutch music journalists. In 1993, he wrote in Het Parool, "The question is from whom Shostakovich suffered the most, during his lifetime under Stalin or after his death from the program commentators. For in the writings about Shostakovich, the connection between the tone of his work and the fate of the suffering Soviet artist has been made so often and exhaustively that the view of the autonomous qualities of his work has largely been obscured. Since then, his work has been said to be about pain and oppression. It is a concept that stimulates the imagination and that makes the cash registers ring worldwide. In the year 2000, yes, that's why we are sitting here, in the year 2000, when all storms have died down, research into the Shostakovich mythology will yield revealing conclusions about the influence of his image on the reception of his work," unquote. In short, this text by Bas van Putten proposes that it was high time to finally judge Shostakovich's music on its own merits. Do you hear Stravinsky's echo here? Music expresses nothing but itself. My question for you is, do you agree? Or do you consider this a typical statement for a spoiled Dutch music journalist? My counter questions are, why should we measure Shostakovich's narrative music with a Stravinskyan abstract yardstick? Is that fair? And if we take Shostakovich out of his context, does the context also disappear from his music? And my last question is, can we afford and allow ourselves to separate Shostakovich's music from the context of terror? My answer on the last question is simply no, and I will be happy to explain that very briefly. 2 months before Russia invaded Ukraine, the Russian Documentation Center Memorial was closed under pressure, and so did later the Sakharov Institute. The documentation of Stalin's great terror has been hushed up so that Putin can repeat it. But also in the West, the Stalin terror seems like a yellowed page from an old-fashioned history book. Here we are too busy with other, also very relevant topics in our history curriculum in the high school. Last year, I asked a total of 30 students who had ever heard of the Gulag. In these groups were, by the way, no Ukrainians. Only 2 students raised their hands. One was Russian and the other was Estonian. For the others, it didn't ring a bell. I had only half an hour to explain all that, and then there was another half hour to introduce Shostakovich and discuss some of his music. During such an intense lesson, I can see how abstract listening makes way for narrative listening, and yes, I consider that is necessary every year again, and especially now. Sadly, but also fortunately, we still have Shostakovich's music that testifies in a very enigmatic way of the black side of humankind that can be found everywhere, not only in Russia. Let's be clear about that. We cannot afford the luxury to state that music expresses nothing but itself. We cannot afford this if there are serious blank spots in our collective knowledge and memory. Personally, I think Shostakovich wrote very important music, as we could hear in the finale of the 5th Symphony, because it screams a warning to us. I think we should listen carefully to that as we hear this music for the very first time. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you all very much. We lost some time, so I'm not going to try to completely get that back, but at least be rather quick, if that's okay with you. I would like to start with you, Saskia, because you ended your story with a thesis and your answer to it. And it's an important thesis, it seemed to me. It's a question of biographical, historical context, obviously. You were very clear that this is of major importance to you. Yet, for example, we almost know nothing about the biography of Shakespeare or of Vermeer, while these artists are, in a way, maybe not completely clear to us, but they speak to us with, and we have no problem whatsoever in understanding them or retrieving meaning from them. Mm-hmm. So, in a more general way, could you maybe elaborate on why you think historical context or biographical context is important? So let me maybe phrase it otherwise. Beside from Shostakovich, would you agree that Stravinsky has a point, or is it a fundamental no?
No. Stravinsky certainly has a point, very interesting point and a very good point. And I think his, as I called his yardstick, can be applied on many compositions, especially on his own compositions.
Okay.
But as I state, I don't think we can allow it in every case. And Shostakovich is such a case, because here we talk about an artist who had to deal with pressure and limitations. And I think as soon as that happens, then we have really a special case. And that is also why I asked, is it fair to measure Shostakovich's music with Stravinskyan yardsticks? Still, you can do that. And I think most of Shostakovich's music holds perfectly also without biographical information. Okay. Certainly.
Thank you. Mr. Akopian, what do you think about this specific subject? When I look at Soviet art criticism or Soviet musicology, as I especially post-Stalinist, then I see a tendency there to be a very anti ideology, and to be very formalist in a way, just to avoid these questions. How in general do you stand to the position of historical context and biographical context?
Well, it's an interesting question indeed. But for me, the historical context is not only historical in terms of social history, but also in terms of music history. And I'll return to this piece, to this ending of the Fifth Symphony. There is a motive there which have to be, we should pay attention to it. It's a descending minor second, B flat A, which appears in almost every work by Shostakovich. For the first time, it appeared in his Second Symphony, and he himself explained this as a wailing for a dead child. Mm. So it's a kind of motive of lamentation, and it can be also seen as a quotation from Boris Godunov, from this Holy Fool's solo at the end of Boris Godunov. So indeed, the historical context is very important, but if we try to explain only in terms of music history, we also find a lot of important connotations. Mm-hmm. This motive of lament, which makes the whole triumph at the end of the Fifth Symphony as if false. It's not a triumph, it's fake triumph. And in general, it can remind us of a feeling which was very well familiar to everybody who lived during the Great Terror. The steps of men who come to one's flat to arrest him. Uh-huh. And this kettle drum solo sounds like these steps. So indeed, again, I think that the historical context is very important, but music historical context is no less important.
Thank you. Do we touch here maybe upon something that in literature we would call Aesopian language, which was, could you say that what Shostakovich is doing with these quotations, that this is a kind of Aesopian musical language like many of the Soviet writers used?
Well, to an extent maybe, but it's something more profound and dramatic than Aesopian language. The Aesopian language as such is a rather simple thing. Mm-hmm. It's Russia would say "kukish v karmane," okay. A fig in the pocket. Shostakovich used this device also, but in the Fifth Symphony, in his masterpieces, he did things which belong to other realms of art and thinking. He was more important and more profound.
Thank you. This brings us also to the question, the more fundamental question of how can art survive under a totalitarian regime? One of the ways that you could do this is by going away, if you had the possibility. Maybe Shostakovich at a certain point still had that possibility. And because we are facing this, again, many intellectuals in Russia now either decide to go away or to stay. This is, again, very an actual question. In the Soviet Union, of course, Shostakovich stayed. Prokofiev even returned in the 30s. He was certainly not the only artist who returned. How do Russian intellectuals at this particular moment look at this question of staying versus going away?
Oh, I cannot say that there is no single formula for everybody. Sure. Every case is individual. Many people feel connected to Russia, and they understand that if they leave, if everybody leaves, Russia will remain and will become a desert, cultural desert, and it's another unwelcome option. So I cannot give a universal
General, no,
formula.
sure.
Yes.
No.
No.
Saskia, if I may ask, your students, when you then explain them more or less something about the historical context, and they start to understand this very ambivalent position that Shostakovich took in, how do they react to that? Because ambivalence is always difficult for everybody, but especially for young people who, as you said before, they try to give themselves completely and emotionally into the music. How do they deal with this ambivalence?
Well, first of all, I cannot speak for all my students.
Sure.
As all teachers know, you are teaching your class and you see those eyes and you don't know what's going on there inside. But I will do my very best. I have a theory about this a little bit, and you can hear it in the 10th Symphony of Shostakovich. You hear this, I call that a David and Goliath situation, where you hear, well, the so-called Stalin theme and Shostakovich's initials played, and the famous Shostakovich theme, and the whole struggle which takes place there. And it is a little bit, it sounds a little bit kitsch and maybe superficial, but I think many students, young people, feel engaged with the tiny, vulnerable artist who is struggling on his own with the system. And I think there's a lot of projection also of personal issues. We have students who have to fight their way into society.
So they identify then with the struggling Shostakovich and not so much with the pillar of Soviet...
I hope they don't identify with Stalin. But I think there is a lot of identification. And I know, when I speak for myself, when I started my paper, I was, I think, 25. And I strongly felt engaged with the artist, Shostakovich. It has a certain romantic...
value, sure.
Value, yeah.
You quoted both Isaiah Berlin and Sokurov in your speech, and both quotations, I think, they gave some questions. Berlin said totalitarian art limits art, of totalitarian limit art, but deepens it as well. I think that at least some artists like Maya Gold, for example, would strongly disagree with that, with the idea that it also deepens. For them, it would only limit, maybe. Is it true, or is it a bit like a vulgarity that totalitarianism would deepen art? This is also said, for example, about Mandelstam sometimes, or is it just a brutal force that destroys? And so is this the kind of idealization of Berlin, or maybe not?
Well, of course, it's a brutal force that destroys, but for those who survive. And since the totalitarian state is interested to keep some personalities, some greater personalities alive and obedient, for them, Shostakovich is the best example. Maybe there are no examples of this same stature which prove Berlin's statement. But in some cases, maybe we can mention also some writers, or for example, Anna Akhmatova, who also survived, and her talent became much more profound under this pressure. Maybe to an extent also the case of Pasternak, who also survived. Shostakovich. There were other examples. People with weaker characters could survive but lose their talents. For example, Prokofiev in his last years.
Yes.
There are many different cases.
Yep. Yeah, and the other quotation was from Sokurov, that, at least to my ear, reflected ideas from the philosopher Boris Groys about that Stalinism was profoundly an aesthetic project. So I think Sokurov says that art in totalitarianism is, in a way, for a totalitarian regime, more important than for a liberal or democratic regime.
Well, right art which serves to the regime. Only
Obviously.
one kind of art is more important. I disagree with Groys' idea because it debases the tragical side of
Yeah, me too.
Stalinism, of course.
Yeah.
But to an extent, Stalinism created or tried to develop an aesthetical doctrine of its own, and good, very talented and honest people did their best to realize their creative ideas within this doctrine. It is truth. It was so indeed.
And if we should look now to the future, just to conclude, because we don't have so much time, if, for example, let's say in 50 years or so, this whole historical context will even be further from us, how will a future audience then look onto these particular pieces?
Well, maybe it's possible that it will be disconnected from this particular history, but I think it will remain music that is dealing with these huge themes like and dictatorial regimes, but they can be everywhere. It's not specifically about Russia.
No, I'm afraid we will have dictatorial regimes in 50 years as well, right? Yeah.
I think this is an ongoing thing.
Okay.
Yes, certainly. Yeah.
Thank you very much for this discussion here. And I think now we will go to our great musicians. So thank you all for the discussion.